Hey everyone! Today we're diving into one of the most intense and dramatic stories from the First Crusade, the Siege of Antioch. This happened way back in 1097 to 1098 CE, when Crusader knights from the west were on a mission to take back Jerusalem. But before they could get there, they had to deal with the heavily fortified city of Antioch in northern Syria. And let me tell you, this siege was no walk in the park. It took a full 8 months and a bit of treachery to finally crack into the city. Even then, they still had to face off against a massive Muslim relief army. Now, why is this story so well known? Well, it wasn't just about the battles. This siege was packed with tales of divine visions, sacred relics, hunger, and pure determination. It's one of the most legendary moments from all the Crusades. So, let's rewind a little bit. The First Crusade kicked off thanks to Pope Urban II, who got the ball rolling after the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos asked for help. You see, the Muslim Seljuk Turks were expanding their territory and had taken a big chunk of Asia Minor from the Byzantines. And to top it off, Jerusalem, probably the holiest city in Christianity, had fallen. That was enough motivation to rally knights from all across Europe. At first, the Crusaders and Byzantines did pretty well. They managed to recapture Nicaea in June 1097 and won a major battle at Dorylaeum shortly after. But by September, the army split up. Some went east to Edessa, while others headed southeast into Cilicia. The main group, though, marched straight for Antioch, which was a key stronghold on the Euphrates frontier. Even though Antioch had lost some of its former glory to cities like Aleppo, it still had a rich history going back to ancient times. It was one of the original seats of the Christian church and had been home to saints like Paul, Peter, and probably even Luke. Retaking Antioch, after a century under Muslim rule, would be a huge win for the Crusaders, boosting their morale and securing future victories in the region. But Antioch was no ordinary city. Sitting on the Orontes River, about 19 kilometers from the coast, it had a population of around 40,000 and was surrounded by massive walls built by the Byzantines in the 10th century. The city was so big and the landscape so tricky that it was impossible for the Crusaders to fully encircle it. At the same time, the defenders couldn't really cover all their walls effectively either. Still, the Crusaders couldn't just bypass the city because it would leave their rear wide open to attack. So, Antioch had to be taken, no matter what. The governor of Antioch at the time was a guy named Yagision, and he ruled over a pretty diverse population of Christians, Greeks, Armenians, and Syrians. The Muslim rulers had been relatively tolerant of the Christian community up until this point, even allowing the Christian patriarch to keep his position. But when Yagision heard the Crusaders were on their way, things changed quickly. The patriarch was thrown in prison, and many important Christian leaders were kicked out of the city. Yagision sent out urgent requests for help from the Seljuk cities of Damascus and Mosul, and even got promises of support from the sultans in Baghdad and Persia. With plenty of water inside the city and around 6,000 to 7,000 armed men, Yagision felt pretty confident that if he could stockpile enough supplies, Antioch's massive fortifications would hold out until reinforcements arrived. On October 20th, 1097, the Crusaders showed up with an army of about 30,000 men. They quickly captured a key bridge over the Orontes River and even snagged a supply convoy heading to Antioch. So things were looking up for the Crusaders. The next day, they found themselves standing before the massive walls of Antioch. And let me tell you, they must have been a little shaken by what they saw. The city was protected by marshes, the river on one side, a mountain ridge on another, and steep defenses rising into the mountains on the other two sides. To top it all off, the citadel towered a whopping 300 meters above the lower city. So after 2 weeks of not much action, the Crusaders were finally getting settled outside Antioch, positioning their forces near the main gates. Leaders like Bohemond of Taranto, Godfrey of Bouillon, and Raymond of Toulouse set up their camps, and it seemed like they were in no rush to attack. They were hoping for reinforcements, especially from Alexios of Byzantium. who might also send over some siege engines. Meanwhile, inside the city, Yaghi wasn't taking many risks with his smaller army. He avoided sending out raiding parties at first, but eventually, small groups started launching minor attacks on the Crusader camps. Around the same time, rumors spread that a relief army from Damascus was heading their way. The tension was building. Winter rolled in, and while the Crusaders were getting a bit desperate for food, Bohemond managed to lure out the Muslim garrison from a nearby fortress called Herink. They were crushed in the open field, which was a huge win for the Crusaders. Not long after that, 13 Genoese ships arrived with reinforcements, weapons, and supplies. Still, food shortages became a real problem, and Crusaders had to venture further out to forage for food, putting themselves at risk of being attacked by the defenders. To make things worse, Yaghi spy network was feeding him every move the Crusaders made. In one bold attack, his forces struck one of the Crusader camps. Although the defenders were pushed back, both sides took heavy losses. Around the same time, Bohemond and Robert of Flanders led a large group on a mission to find food near Hama. Unfortunately, Robert's group ran into that same relief army from Damascus and got surrounded. Bohemond, lagging behind, used the element of surprise to rescue them, defeating the Muslim forces, but the Crusaders still had to return to Antioch empty-handed. Back at the city, the situation was grim. Rain poured down for weeks, food supplies were low, and knights were dying of hunger. Morale plummeted, and desertions became common, with the Crusader army now down to just 700 knights. To mock the starving Christians, Yaghi had the Patriarch of Antioch hung in a cage over the city walls. It was a brutal time, so much so that the Crusaders even began robbing Muslim graves just to get their hands on anything valuable. In the midst of this chaos, Bohemond's ambitions started to show. He began hinting that he might leave the siege to take care of his lands in Italy unless he was promised rule over Antioch if they captured it. The other Crusader leaders didn't agree, but Bohemond stayed anyway, clearly waiting for his moment to seize the city for himself. Meanwhile, the Muslim cities weren't sitting idle. Another relief army from Aleppo tried to retake Herink. When Bohemond heard about this, he led the Crusader knights to drive them back to Aleppo. But as soon as he left, Yaghi took advantage and launched a massive attack on the Crusader infantry still camped outside Antioch. Once again, though, the Crusader knights returned just in time and forced the attackers back into the city. While the battles were fierce, food was still a major problem. Luckily for the Crusaders, supplies started arriving by sea from Cyprus, and an English fleet, led by Edgar Atheling, delivered siege engines and building materials from the Byzantine Emperor in March. However, when the Crusaders went to retrieve these supplies, they were ambushed by a Muslim force. After a brutal fight, the Crusaders managed to kill up to 1,500 Turks and secured the much-needed supplies. By mid-March, the Crusaders had used the new materials to their advantage, building towers to attack key positions, including a fortified bridge and one of the major gates still under Muslim control. Cutting off these access points allowed the Crusaders to get food without being attacked, and they even started trading with local merchants. But then, in May, came the news they'd been dreading. A massive Muslim army was heading for Antioch, made up of troops from Mosul, Baghdad, Persia, and Mesopotamia. If this army arrived before the Crusaders captured the city, it could wipe them out. They had to move fast. Luckily for them, the leader of the Muslim relief force, Kerboga of Mosul, decided to make a 3-week stop at Edessa to deal with a potential threat there. This gave the Crusaders just enough time to plan their final assault on Antioch. Unbeknownst to the other leaders, Bohemond had been secretly negotiating with a traitor inside the city, an Armenian named Firuz. Firuz was ready to switch sides and help the Crusaders take Antioch from within. But just as the final plans were being made, panic swept through the Crusader camp. Many, including a leader named Stephen of Blois, fled, fearing the incoming Muslim army. What they didn't know was that Firuz had finally agreed to open a section of the city's walls to Bohemond's forces. The plan was set. The Crusaders would pretend to move away from the city to meet the approaching Muslim army, then, under the cover of night, return to attack the city's western wall where Firuz would let them in. It worked like a charm. 60 of Bohemond's knights scaled the walls and took control of the northwestern towers without resistance. They opened the gates, and the rest of the Crusader army poured into the city. On June 3, 1098, after 8 long months, the mighty city of Antioch had fallen, but not by brute force, by treachery. Once inside, the Crusaders unleashed chaos. Muslims were slaughtered, including women, and even Christians weren't spared in the confusion. Yagision tried to escape through a small gate, but his son, Shams ad-Dawla, gathered what remained of the troops and retreated to the city's high citadel. Bohemond immediately launched an attack, but it was beaten back, and he was even wounded in the process. Meanwhile, the rest of the Crusaders, distracted by their newfound wealth, were busy looting the city, forgetting that the massive Muslim army was still on its way. So, by early June, things took a dark twist. Kerboga, the Muslim commander, arrived at Antioch on June 7th, camping in the same spots the Crusaders had held for so long. Now the Crusaders were the ones trapped. They had become the besieged. In a desperate attempt to control the situation, they built a wall to separate the upper citadel from the lower part of the city. But when they launched attacks on Kerboga's forces, it didn't go well. Once again, starvation hit hard, and it became the Crusaders' biggest enemy. They were hoping, praying, that the Byzantine Emperor Alexios would show up with reinforcements. Here's where things got complicated. Alexios was on his way, but something went terribly wrong. He ran into refugees who were fleeing Antioch, and they told him that the Crusaders were on the verge of collapse and that a massive Muslim army had them surrounded. Thinking the cause was already lost, Alexios decided to turn back, saving his resources for what he thought was a doomed mission. But that wasn't all. There was also word that another Turkish army was heading straight for Alexios. It made sense to retreat at that point. When the Crusaders found out they'd been left high and dry by the Byzantines, Bohemond was furious. He had already been scheming to keep Antioch for himself, and this was the last straw. Any promises he had made to hand the city over to the Byzantines were officially off the table. The Crusaders and Byzantines were done. From here on out, Bohemond was in it for himself. Meanwhile, back at Antioch, things were getting intense. On June 12th, Kerboga launched a massive assault on the southwestern walls of the city. His forces came so close to breaking through, but somehow the Crusaders managed to push them back. Barely. Desperation was at an all-time high for the Crusaders. They were starving, exhausted, and on the brink of collapse. They even tried to negotiate a surrender, asking Kerboga for safe passage out of the city. He refused. It looked like all hope was lost. And then, out of nowhere, things took a bizarre turn. A poor peasant named Peter Bartholomew came forward with what he claimed was a vision. He told the Crusader leaders that St. Andrew himself had appeared to him, revealing the location of one of Christianity's holiest relics, the lance that had pierced Jesus' side during the crucifixion. Peter insisted it was buried beneath the Cathedral of St. Peter in Antioch. They didn't have much to lose, so they started digging, and incredibly, they found something. The story spread like wildfire. This wasn't just a relic, it was a sign from God. According to legend, whoever carried this holy lance would be invincible in battle. The Crusader army, weak and hungry as they were, suddenly believed they had divine favor on their side. So, with this newfound hope, they prepared for a full-scale assault on Kerboga's forces. And honestly, the timing couldn't have been better. Kerboga's army was already struggling with desertions. His coalition of forces from Mosul, Baghdad, Persia, and Mesopotamia was starting to fall apart. On June 28th, the Crusaders launched their attack, and it was an all-out success. Legend has it that, as the Crusaders charged, they were watched over by a group of ghostly knights led by none other than St. George himself, standing on the hills above. Whether you believe that or not, the effect on the battlefield was real. Gerboga's troops panicked, and many of his commanders just gave up. They didn't want to fight for him anymore. The remaining Muslim forces in the citadel saw what was happening and surrendered the very next day. Just like that, the siege was over, and Antioch was back in Christian hands. But it wasn't the end of the crusade. After securing Antioch, the crusaders weren't about to stop. By December 1098, they were on the move again, marching south toward their ultimate goal, Jerusalem. On their way, they captured several key Syrian port cities, and finally, on June 7, 1099, they arrived at the gates of Jerusalem. After a short siege, they captured the city on July 15, 1099. It was a moment that marked the pinnacle of the First Crusade. But there was still unfinished business in Antioch. Back in Constantinople, Alexios wasn't thrilled about Bohemon's little power grab. He wanted Antioch back, and in 1107 he sent an army to take the city or, at the very least, cut it off from the rest of the Crusader-held territories. By then, Bohemond had already left Antioch and returned to Italy. In Italy, he convinced Pope Paschal II and the French King Philip I that the real threat to Christianity wasn't the Muslims, it was the Byzantines. Bohemond painted Alexios as a treacherous emperor, and together they planned an invasion of Byzantine territory, targeting Albania. But that plan didn't work out. Alexios was ready for them, and he mobilized his best troops to crush Bohemond's forces. On top of that, the Pope pulled his support, leaving Bohemond with no choice but to back down. He was forced to accept Byzantine rule over Antioch, though he did manage to stay on as the ruler, under Alexios's name of course. This marked the beginning of a new era of power struggles in the region, with crusaders carving out their own territories, often at odds with both Muslim forces and their supposed Byzantine allies.